Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties, episode 9 for season 2018. My name is Lee. This week it's just me and Zeev, yet again.
G'day.
And we're going to be talking about two topics. We're going to be talking about ongoing issues with child abuse in the Northern Territory, and we're going to talk about South Africa and plans to strip white farmers of their land. So we'll start off with that one. Yes. So, the last week, the South African Parliament has passed a bill to start stripping farmers from their land off farmers, and to then redistribute it. It's very much along the similar sort of lines to what happened in Zimbabwe. Though of course, I've read some things saying, "Oh no, we'll do it differently." Libertarians have unsurprisingly, and conservatives, I guess, for that matter, have unsurprisingly, decried that plan. So yeah, we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to give it an unorthodox opinion. I think there's two aspects to this issue which have different responses for libertarians. So I think on the issue of how it's going to be allocated, yes, this is going to be a complete train wreck. This is going to be a Zimbabwe-style disaster where the government's going to hand it to their cronies, the production's going to fall off a cliff, they're going to be getting food imports from a country that previously provided enough food for itself. Having said that, I think there's legitimate reason to think that land redistribution or some sort of look at how land has been allocated or how it's sort of played out is probably not a terrible idea in a country where they had systematic, widespread deprivation, attacks on the private property rights of blacks. So I think at its core, I think there's a separate issue of if theoretically, if you had a system which was incredibly racist that systematically deprived blacks of their rights and of their land and reallocated that land to favoured white interests, is it therefore okay later on to come along and undo that? And I think, in some ways it's a theoretical question. I don't know enough about South African history to really conclusively say, oh yes, in every instance, the government should be taking away land from farmers. But I think in other circumstances where government gives out privileges, libertarians are usually okay with the government taking away those privileges.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
And I guess we can start off by saying that you're probably right about the ultimate consequences for the people of South Africa that would result if people's land was taken away from them without compensation, and their farmers who currently own that land and make productive use of it. As anyone with basic Google skills can find out, Zimbabwe did the same thing back in around 2000, and the result was, and continues to be, endemic malnutrition and at times almost mass starvation in Zimbabwe. As a result, it was a tragic thing, and
as well as incredible violence towards those farmers as well. People being murdered,
yes.
Like mobs showing up and attacking people. So yeah,
yes.
that aspect of it is not tolerable in any way, shape, or form. And if I was, I know in WA we've had a lot of South Africans move here to get away from what they see as the sort of slow degradation of law and order in South Africa, and undoubtedly a lot of those farmers are going to try and move to Australia to get away from that sort of violence, and that's totally understandable. And not only that, the border should be completely open, not just for them, for everybody, but particularly in this circumstance, Australia should be welcoming people who are being subject to violence to come here freely.
Yeah, sure. I guess the next point to mention is whether some distribution is in theory warranted. And I guess there's a lot to unpack there as well. I guess the first point to mention is that redistribution presupposes that the current owners of the land have not gained it legitimately. Now, when we talk about the people who purchased it today, usually we're not necessarily talking about, or we're not talking about people who violently took the land from somebody else. They would have purchased it under a contract with someone else, or they would have received it as a gift from someone else. Was there violence in the acquisition of the property a few hundred years ago when the South African and or Boer community came there and took occupation of those lands? Possibly. I mean, I recall there was a Boer War, for example. So certainly some people did not...
Yeah, that was between the British and the Boers. So...
Yes.
that was essentially about like the Brits essentially declaring sovereign, like sole control over South Africa. So it's
Indeed.
not quite the same yet. But
not quite the same thing, quite so. And going even further back, I believe there were some tribes that did engage in some warfare with the Boers and I believe the British. My knowledge of this area is as limited as yours, Lee, if not more so. To be frank, I don't know. And for that reason, I'm kind of cautious about saying that there was a case for redistribution in the first place. But secondly, even if there was, I don't see how that applies to the current owners of the land. And I mean, there may have been some invasion originally, and that, if so, it deserves to be said, of course, but that doesn't mean that the current owners of the land are to blame, and it doesn't mean that we know how to justly redistribute the land, so to speak. There's no real way of doing that. So, yeah, I mean, as difficult as it may be, I think the key point to bear in mind is that South Africa's socialist or quasi-socialist system, or deeply corrupt system of government at the moment, ironically continues to prop up its farmer class as the or its white class as the wealthier class in society, because they are the only people with the work habits and well, not the only people with the work habits, but they are people with work habits who are able to overcome the culture of theft and predation that the South African state has created, and which is now endemic in its society. I mean, we need to be clear about this. It's not a result of race. It's a result of the poor incentives created by the South African government. Legal work is difficult to find. Therefore, people pursue illegal work to make a living, crime. And sometimes that can be drugs. Sometimes it can just be kidnappings and murders and the like. And this is what happens at the extreme end of welfare state socialist policy. We see it in South Africa. We see it in Venezuela. Ordinary people turn to crime, sometimes devastating crime, to make any kind of living. It's an awful thing to say, but that's the result. And it will continue to be that way until South Africa and Venezuela, for that matter, change their policies and encourage lawful business and production of goods. This is a step backwards, even further from that goal. It's going to make business and life in South Africa even worse. And gosh, it's an awful thing to contemplate, frankly.
Yeah, so I think compared to the history of Australia, the history of South Africa is much more complicated. So Australia's pretty straightforward. The British government showed up, said, "Yep, this is all ours," and then systematically basically took the land and drove off anybody who didn't like it. I think South Africa is a bit more like, say, New Zealand, where there was sort of traders colonies that were established by sort of traders, and I mean the Dutch East India Company was involved, so it's not strictly, the British showed up or the Dutch showed up and said, yeah, this is all ours, piss off if you don't like it. I think it's, there was, and people, there was the Trek Boers where they basically were sick of the Dutch East India Company, so they started moving elsewhere. I think there are, I remember reading something where, a particular king enabled one of the first colonies to be there because he wanted a buffer between another tribe and him. So yeah, it's not straightforward, and unpicking all of that and figuring out which is going where is difficult. I mean, I think there's a very... in 1913, there was a particular act of parliament which essentially stopped... was to sort of, at the beginning of apartheid, basically kind of stripped natives of their land to a certain extent. So I don't think it's all like ancient history, or not even ancient history, but, long history. Some of it's been in the last 100 years or so. Having said that, like, just to get to the issue of, to what extent current farmers are liable to, in this process. So Brian Kaplan, who's an economist, which you've reviewing his or have reviewed his book on education. He's written a really good blog post on, like, imagine if you came across a watch and you just found this watch and you couldn't find the owner. Well, you can essentially take it as yours. But if somebody comes along at a later stage and demonstrates that it was their watch the whole time, you would be essentially obligated to give them the watch without receiving compensation.
Sure.
So theoretically, and I want to state, this is just for a discussion of principles. Theoretically, if if it could be proved that a particular farm was the property of natives, and I should say African, like tribes people, because really anybody born in a country is a native. If non-Europeans owned the land and it was taken from them by the state and given to a farmer, that farmer has no recourse, really. They would give. Well, I would think of it like I use the example of like Uber, like the taxi industry, right? So the government comes along and says, "Okay, taxis, we're going to give you the exclusive license to do this thing. You solely will have access to this particular, economic process."
Yep.
And anybody, we're going to keep the competition out, and then Uber comes along, they can't keep the competition out. So essentially, what right do taxi license holders have to compensation? Well, nothing. The government has given them an illegitimate right to something that was never theirs to begin with. Therefore, they have no real claim of compensation when it's taken from them.
Sure.
So,
let me just add to that.
Level, that's what I think.
Let me just add to that analogy there of the watch that was picked up. Now, suppose that watch was picked up, and you don't know who it belongs to, and you pick it up, you claim it as your own, and then you sell it to someone else who has no idea how you got it, and then he sells it to someone else who had no involvement in how you got it, and then he sells it to someone else who had no involvement in how he got it, who gives it to someone else who had no involvement in, and repeat that about 20, 30 times. And then the original owner turns up. Now, at what point do we say that the original owner's claim to the watch is extinguished? Generally, I would say if someone has purchased that watch without knowing that it's stolen goods, and he got it at least from a person who did not steal it himself, I think we can at that point say that you've got to draw the line somewhere, so to speak. On the other hand, you can say, well, in perpetuity, just every time, it doesn't matter if it's sold 30, 40, 100 million times, it always belongs to the original owner. I think that would create some uncertainty, though. That would be my view.
Yeah, so leaving aside the question of how do you actually figure out who owns what, which is a separate question. Theoretically, you would never relinquish your right to that property. Like, it is yours. That's the nature of... If you believe in Lockean property rights, there is no... There's no end to when you can own something. Like, it's not like you have to renew your license every, 1,000 years or whatever. It's... If you own this, you own it forever until you dispose of it. But we get into the issue of, like, okay... And this is what comes up whenever I talk about Aboriginal rights to land. It's like, oh, what about the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans? They went to England. Well, yeah, okay. 1,000 years ago, when one group of white people came along and kicked the crap out of another group of white people and took over, it's going to be really bloody hard. But these sorts of situations, both with Aboriginals and with some of this stuff to do with apartheid, we're not talking about like ancient history. We're talking about states who have records. Who have, you can go through and figure out, who owns what. Now, did this African tribe take from this African tribe? Okay, that's a lot harder because they didn't keep records. They just fought each other and they took stuff and they didn't, But, South African government, British government, Australian government have extensive records on lots of this stuff. And you can kind of figure out what's going on. So, I think the practicalities is less of an issue especially if you're talking about the last 100 years.
It's not even so much an issue of practicality as it is an issue that at some point people who are transacting on the basis that they're not purchasing stolen goods also have claims to this property. And those claims are competing claims to the original owner's claim. And at some point, I suggest that you have to say, look, there are later owners of this property. They weren't involved in any wrongdoing. And why do they deserve to be punished as well? Anyway.
Well, actually, there's a counterpoint to that. Would that claim, though, be against the government that gave them the illegitimate right in the first place? So...
no, because they purchased the land from prior innocent landowners. What claim do they have against the government of the day?
Well, because the government was the one that took the land and gave it to somebody, gave it to their friends in the first place. So, you know, like, if you're talking about that sort of thing, I mean, like, I think taxi plate owners don't really have that claim because, like, it's...
No, they don't.
It's different. But, like, I think in terms of, like, you could say, well, you stole this land from this group of people, you gave it to me, I've built up, you know, I've made this, I've now lost this thing...
yes.
If you had done this legitimately, we wouldn't have this problem in the first place. I mean, you're the lawyer. You tell me if that's like a sound argument in terms of contract law. But like that seems to be more, like if there is a claim to compensation for giving back that land, it should really be against the offending party who took it in the first place illegitimately, which is the government, rather than the people get to keep the land in some sort of competing claim system. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, look, I see the point that you're getting at. I'm just saying that at some point, you've got to say that, in my opinion, you've got to say that, you know, the land has been peacefully changing hands for generations, and prior claims, such as they are, have been extinguished. You might say that creates injustice, sure, but at this point, redistributing the land would also create injustice. So that's my perspective.
So what sort of time frame would you be talking about in terms of like when would those claims be extinguished in your mind? You don't have to like say it's exactly at like 112 years, but like broadly speaking, like what period of time?
Broadly speaking, if you have a scenario, I think when so when you're dealing with, say, a second or third sale or purchase, broadly speaking.
Wow, okay.
So when you're dealing with that, I think it's harder to say that the second or third purchaser down the track who wasn't involved in the original wrongdoing can really be said to be to blame for it, so to speak. Now, that can be as close as a couple of years away from the event, frankly. Now, or on the other hand, a few centuries. I don't know.
Well, so, in the case of inheritance, would that change your mind? So, if it was given to a family who then passed it down the generations, so say in 1913,
probably, I'm willing to say that a gift or inheritance should be excluded from that.
Okay.
Maybe.
So it's actually when it's like transferred ownership totally.
Yep, by way of a purchase.
Yep.
I think it creates uncertainty otherwise. But look, I hear your point of view as well. I just don't see how, in practice, South Africa's property rights can be overturned in the name of justice, and nor do you, as you've already conceded up front. That's that, and this is actually why I think, because there's no way of winding back the system now, and any attempt to do so would create injustice for current owners. All I've done is give you a principled outline of why.
Sure.
I think,
and I mean that's a fair sort of counterpoint. I think. I mean, I still disagree, but I mean, I think there's within the last 100 years, when you're talking about, like, say, the beginning of apartheid, if there was a systematic attempt to strip African, Native Africans of their land, I think you can probably wind that back without too many issues. Having said all that, certainly
if you can find the original owner or their survivor, so to speak, I think you'd have a much better case.
Well, I mean, you could be talking about people who were probably even maybe just alive when this happened. You know,
Maybe.
and it's like 104 years ago that land so if you see it as a systematic thing, like it wasn't like it all happened overnight. So in somebody's lifetime, they could have had their land taken from them and handed to a white farmer.
Sure.
So that doesn't seem to me to be like a lengthy enough period of time to say, well, you have no claim now.
Well, if that is the case, I mean, you could say perhaps that the political class of the day owes some liability to the wronged party, or both wronged parties. But I would kind of prefer to actually trace that back to the specific people who did it on some level, which may be pretty impractical because those politicians are long dead.
Sure,
anyway.
yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, that's fair. I mean, the reason I even want to bring this up though is because I think quite often libertarians can kind of almost default to a sort of corporatist.
This is the way it is. Yes, this is the way it is, and thus it's justified. Well, I take your point. It is because people are too quick to assume that the way of things is the way it ought to have been always, and that the present way is the best way, and so on. But you do make an important point that the property rights that people enjoy nowadays are in ways a product of violence, and that needs to be acknowledged. So that's not to say that there's a redistribution out there that will solve that problem.
No.
It's just, in my opinion, to say that it needs to be acknowledged as part of Australia's dark past, probably part of South Africa's dark past too.
Well, and I think one of the issues when it comes to the actual implementation of this policy is that it's very racialized. Which I'm not. I mean, I can totally understand why people might sort of be like that. But like there are people who bought land legitimately. I mean, there's been European settlers in South Africa for
there are probably
400
some black
years.
Farmers who, I should say, there are probably some black farmers who will be affected by this. I mean, the quotes emerging from this from these politicians are that white or black, they'll be taking that farmland.
Yes.
I mean, they're fixating, of course, on the white farmers, but. That appears to be their line. And I think the other important point to mention is that whatever theory there may be, the reality is that a kleptocratic political class like South Africa's socialist elite is going to make a horrible mess of things. So no one, I think, has the requisite wisdom to assess how to divvy up land like this 50, 60 years down the line, I think. I mean, it's one thing to do it perhaps a few years down the line and say, well, these are the people who held title a few years ago. Those are their certificates of title. They can have them back now. And they can have that property back now and to do that 2-3 years afterwards. But the more time it takes, the more damage and harm it causes, even if it's in some sense justified. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why my solution for like Aboriginal issues of Aboriginal land is essentially to treat anything that's currently got a private property owner as a taking. Essentially compensate at market value for the government taking the land. Just because it's so difficult to figure out how you can go about having a system that's...
But who do you compensate? And that's the difficulty as well.
Well, you compensate the original owners because, I mean, like, I think...
How do you trace them?
Well, I mean...
Who do you trace them to?
The descendants. You essentially say, okay, the people who owned it then, who would own that estate, even collectively. I mean, I have no problem with collective ownership.
Sure.
So you need to treat it as, like, this was a collective inheritance. And...
Yep.
Then you just go back and say, okay, well, this is how much the land was worth at this time. Add in inflation.
At which time?
Here's a check.
Adding inflation, here's a check. Okay.
Yeah. It wasn't like at 1788, bam, all the land was gone. I mean, there would be parts of Australia that wasn't even truly kind of annexed by the Australian government probably until the 1900s.
Absolutely.
Realistically. So, you're talking about a period of time. I mean, I think the Perth colony was settled in like 1832 or something. So it's not, we're talking about like less than 200 years ago. And again, there's all these records, it's not like this is, I mean, there is some issues.
Pinning that down to specific owners. I mean, I think outside of remote communities where you can tentatively assume that the people in those remote communities are descendants of the people who lived there 50 years ago or 100 years ago, more or less. Leaving aside those people, I mean, the indigenous people in the cities are likely to be, people from those very remote communities who have moved to the cities. So
Sure.
to say that those people deserve some compensation for confiscations from the city, well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's an uncertainty issue.
I mean, I think, there's nothing that a genealogist can't figure out. I mean, there's when I say that, like, as in there's birth.
You're being very,
there's
very
birth,
optimistic about the powers of genealogy.
No, I'm relatively confident in the power of bureaucracy. I mean, this is really just you need to look at births, deaths, and marriages and figure out who was born when and how, and you just kind of try. I mean, there are issues. Maybe you have a system where it's like, okay, you have a period of for 5 years, we're going to sort of say make your claim now, and then after that, you close the books and say, well, you can't make a claim anymore. So, like, I'm not like this is not to say that it's going to be perfect. Every single person who deserves is going to get their payback. I'm not a utopian. I don't believe in those sorts of outcomes.
Yes.
But just to say that, like, you can get something that's like reasonably close to what you would call justice, and I think you can.
And who would pay for it, though? The current proprietor, or
no? You just pay it. You treat it as a taking, so it's coming out of tax dollars.
Okay.
So you just, and I mean, I guess it did, like, none of this land was worth a whole lot when it was taken. I mean, that's the other thing. Like, the market value of this land is not, like, it's valuable now because we know how to mine things. But, like, if you go back 200 years ago and find a patch of dirt in the Pilbara and say, how much is this land worth? It's basically worth nothing. So to a certain extent, like, you might even want to be a bit generous in the compensation, because I suspect the actual market value of this land of the fringes of an basically almost uninhabited country is basically zero. And the other thing is, not all the land was owned. So you only need to figure out, like, what was actually kind of locking in.
I think this exercise, I just don't know if it's worthwhile. If it's going to be ending up with near zero compensation for people in areas that aren't, that have near zero market value, I don't know if that, in a practical sense, is worthwhile doing.
Well, it's not near zero, and compound interest is, as Aaron said, the most powerful force in the universe.
That's true. That's true. No, look, on that. Sorry, I was just trying to. If given compound interest, perhaps it may amount to something, but we'd need to kind of look at the hard data or hard estimates before signed off.
I think, like,
compensation scheme, which appears to mean that people born today are liable for the sins of the past. I'm not sure I agree with that. But
well, a corporate form would be, if you think of, if you think of the Australian government as a corporate. I mean, technically it's the British government that's at fault, but if BHP, if it turned out that 150 years ago BHP, which probably didn't exist then, had committed some terrible crime, the nature of legal perpetuity, would mean that the current shareholders would be like, or not, the current company as it is would be liable for the sins of the decisions made by the CEO back in whenever.
I don't know about that. Lee. I don't know if we should quite go that far. Certainly, I can understand 10 years or 20 years, but 100 years, I don't know. All right. But that ties into the next discussion point today, sort of.
Well, we're at 28. I was going to say, we're at 28 minutes.
Yes.
Do we want to just leave it for this week and maybe come back and talk about the Indigenous thing? Because I think, otherwise we'll probably end up going for about an hour. But maybe on Thursday, if you're free, we'll have a chat. But yeah, anyway.
We'll see how we go.
I think we had a pretty in-depth discussion about property rights. So, like, we've still got a couple of minutes. Are there any final thoughts about what's going on with South Africa? And
I hope things improve over there dramatically and soon. Yeah, but I don't have much hope for it, frankly. But I hope it does, nevertheless. That's all.
Yep, I think this is the perfect example of why immigration is so important, because it's this is likely to go bad. And
very soon, and a lot of people are going to suffer, regardless of their race. The vast majority of South Africans are going to face malnutrition, if not starvation, as
Sure.
a result of this kind of policy if it's seriously implemented. And yeah,
And that actually
absolutely
brings
right.
up a point about like non-whites, like people in people will suffer because of
The people who will suffer most will be black South Africans.
yeah, and they might want to get out as well before it gets too bad. And that's one of the problems with immigration is we wait till it gets really, really, really bad, and then we say, okay, we'll let in some of you. When people are already starting to die, if we let them in now, then less people die. Much like
Absolutely.
the Jews in Europe. If we let them come here in the mid 30s or whatever, there'd be a lot more Jews.
That's true, and it's the same story played out with every crisis over and over again, unfortunately. But it needs to be said over and over again, and hopefully we have some impact at the margin. Hey,
That's
all
it.
right.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for joining me, Zeev. Thank you, dear listener.
Yeah, well-
Thank you, dear viewer, for joining us. We're on YouTube. We're on iTunes. Check us out. We got like our Facebook page, and yeah, we'll be back at it potentially with another conversation this week, depending on how time lines up. But otherwise, we'll see you again next week.